You're listening to the Back Home Network, presented by Home Field Apparel.
Welcome back to CrimsonCast. Galen Clavio joining you. It is the 4th of June of 2024. Hopefully you're all having a wonderful start to what really is the official beginning of summer. I know we technically don't start for another couple of weeks, but hey, it's June. Everybody's thinking summer. Hopefully you've gotten at least one lake day in, or whatever the equivalent is in your neck of the woods. So today we're going to be talking more regarding NIL, college athletics, that whole setup. If you've not listened to the first episode that we recorded and released late last week, I'd highly recommend that you do that, just because it lays a lot of groundwork in explaining what the settlement was or is between the NCAA and its member institutions and the plaintiffs in the House versus NCAA case. Talked a lot on that episode about kind of, what the implications are broadly, and also talked a little bit about things like Title IX and how that might apply. As I mentioned on that podcast, all of this is a moving target. And so you got to kind of take things as they come with a lot of this stuff. But what I'm trying to do with these podcasts is flesh out a little bit more of the situation and also answer the questions that you folks have asked and continue to ask regarding just how things are set up right now and what we're looking at as far as college sports. So that's what this episode's about. We're going to delve into some more specifics regarding everything from fair market value of NIL all the way through, what we might expect in terms of, the outcomes for certain types of athletes or athletes in certain classifications. We're going to tackle the larger question of what does the NCAA need to do to change its model potentially on the next episode, where we should have a guest joining us. So be sure to tune in for that. That should come out later this week. Before we get to that, just a couple reminders. First of all, we're brought to you by Home Field Apparel here on the Back Home Network. And Home Field Apparel, your place to go for the finest in college fashions, the softest fabrics, the coolest designs. They've got a brand new, I'll just call it, it's the summer series, but they've got a lot of fascinating mascot-based apparel coming out. If you ever watched Pulp Fiction and you're familiar with the UC Santa Cruz Banana Slugs shirt that gets worn in a later scene in that movie, well, guess what? Home Field's got the UC Santa Cruz Banana Slugs as part of their Sweet Summer 7 selection. That comes out this Friday. But you can sign up ahead of time and get a subscription box, and the subscription box will send this stuff right to your door. And you can either do a hat-based one or a shirt-based one or both. But if you head over to homefieldapparel.com, or if you download their app, you can see how to get all of those things up and running. So again, go to homefieldapparel.com, check it out, use the code HOME23, HOME23, and get 15% off your first order. Again, homefieldapparel.com, proud sponsor of the Back Home Network. Also a reminder, we're on Substack here on CrimsonCast. Go to crimsoncast.substack.com and register yourself. Free subscription. You get podcasts delivered right to your inbox, as well as other materials. I'll probably have a couple of articles that I will link in this episode that I send out. We also have a paid subscriber option. We'll do VIP videos for you about once a week during the season, a little bit less frequently during the off season, just because there's not that much to talk about. But it's a way for you to help financially support the podcast for a reasonable $50 a year or $5 a month. But head over to crimsoncast.substack.com. Join the almost 1,000 subscribers on the CrimsonCast Substack. Big event I wanted to let you all know about, and that is, of course, coming up at the end of June, the Indiana Volleyball Golf Outing. This is an event that is intended to, raise awareness about the volleyball program, get some NIL money running, and just generally speaking, try to get people involved with volleyball. This is being sponsored by Hoosiers Connect and will be taking place on June 27th at 10 a.m. at the Hawthorns Golf and Country Club in Fishers, Indiana. Join us for a golf outing to benefit NIL opportunities for the volleyball program. It'll feature members of the volleyball team and coaching staff, as well as a silent auction. And this is a very reasonably priced event, if I do say so myself. It's $1,000 for a team if you want to get a team together and play in this, and that includes breakfast, lunch, a silent auction, and, of course, the chance to meet some of our volleyball athletes, as well as Indiana volleyball swag. There's also an individual option if you want to register for that. It's $275, and it includes everything. So you're only paying essentially, you pay $25 more as an individual. If you can get 4 people together, you can save $100 by getting a team together. There's also sponsorship opportunities. You can sponsor a hole for $250, and there are both front and back 9 sponsors. There's also additional course sponsors available through this opportunity. You can reach out to them at connect@HoosiersConnect.com if you'd like to explore the sponsorship opportunities on the holes. If you'd like to register as an individual or as a team, you can go to inforindiana.com/volleyball. inforindiana.com/volleyball. Or you can go to the IU Volleyball Twitter feed and you can click the link there. You can find it very easily. You can also donate directly if you can't make the golf outing on that inforindiana.com/volleyball page. I will be there. I'll be, I believe, emceeing the event. So you get a chance to see me. Hopefully that doesn't make you less interested in going. Hopefully it makes you more interested in going, but would love to see you out there. Again, it's 10 o'clock in the morning on Thursday, June 27th. That's at the Hawthorns Golf Club in Fishers, Indiana. It is the Indiana Volleyball NIL event. Would love to see you out there. So hopefully we'll see you out there. Let us know if you've got any questions. All right, let's go ahead and jump into the bulk of what we're going to be talking about today, which is, of course, as we mentioned, what's going on with college athletics. And we had some questions that we wanted to get to, as well as just some general topics that we wanted to try to tackle. So I couldn't help but laugh at one of the questions that we got from Cruz Martin, which had very little to do with NIL, but it does have something to do with college sports. His question was, how can Peacock improve their event coverage from year 1 to year 2? And it's obviously, we're not getting away from Peacock anytime soon. Peacock's going to be a part of coverage of Big Ten athletics for a while. I'll say this. I think, the biggest problems that I saw with the Peacock coverage last year, at least with basketball, I didn't honestly, there were some items with football. I think the biggest problem I remember with the football broadcast on Peacock was the audio mix sucked, frankly. It wasn't very good. But that's been a problem with sports television in general. I don't know if you've noticed this. It's been a big problem in the NBA playoffs where the sound mix has just really been bad. It hasn't captured the crowd noise particularly well, and that's something they need to fix. But to me, the larger issues with Peacock, they looked like they were doing remote broadcasts. And I believe they may have had the broadcasters themselves on site, but it looked like everything else was kind of being produced remotely. They may have had the broadcasters remote as well, but the whole thing just kind of felt underproduced, given that you're dealing with, in many cases, with a lot of the IU games that we saw, some pretty important games, a lot of conference games, a lot of games that had a lot of implications. And honestly, I think that that's the big pitfall that you're going to have anytime you're doing streaming coverage like that, where you're doing most of the actual production work off-site. I don't know that there's a way that they can fix that without getting crews on site. But the whole idea that NBC, and for that matter, ESPN, and for that matter, the Big Ten Network have with this, is that it saves them money by not being on site. Obviously you've got the cameras on site, but everything else is back in a studio, whether that's in Stamford, Connecticut, or Chicago, or LA, or Bristol. So that would be the easiest way. But look, I think ultimately, NBC, we have to keep in mind, even though they've done college basketball, college football before, it's always been on a much smaller scale. And I think that Peacock, the hope would be that they were going to grow into the technical ramifications of what they signed on for. And it just looked like they weren't ready last year, which I understand that from a media business perspective. I don't sympathize with it because it's like, you're going to pay the money. You have an obligation to put a decent product out there for the people that are watching. But at the end of the day, they've got the contract. It's kind of like, for those of you who play video games, it's like when kind of a mid-tier or lower publisher gets a licensing title and then they make like a bad game. It's like, this game should have been better. We should have done better with this IP, but that's what happens with exclusivity, which is what you have with Peacock and these broadcasts. So look, I hope they take it seriously. And honestly, I think the biggest lever that can be pulled as far as making Peacock quality better comes from the athletic directors themselves, comes from the people working in the athletic departments. They're the ones who should be concerned about the way that their teams and their games are being put out there to the public. This is not something you can skimp on. And for the criticisms that one might levy at ESPN for a variety of things, one of the things that I rarely am critical of ESPN on is the production quality of their game broadcast. Not that they're all perfect, but they clearly do put a lot of effort into that. And that's not always the case with the other networks. So that would be the big thing I'd say. Hopefully athletic directors got together, went to the Big Ten, said, hey, we love the extra coverage. Maybe they don't, but we appreciate the fact we have to do this. Maybe a better way of putting it. Please make the quality better. Here's a bunch of examples of what NBC did badly last year. Maybe that will help. Okay, so let's jump in and talk more specifically about some of the house-related stuff. So something that I wanted to pick back up on from last time was this whole idea ultimately of athletes as employees. And I think that this is one of those situations where when we think about this, a lot of people feel like hardwired to say, well, athletes shouldn't be employees. And yet, as I think we talked about a little bit on the last podcast, I don't know what the argument is for saying that athletes at the college, by the way, for those of you who are new to this, I refuse to use the term student athlete. You're not going to hear me say it, or if you do, it was a mistake. And I will go back and say, sorry, didn't mean to say student athlete, meant to just say athlete. The reason I refuse to use the term student athlete is, as I've explained many times, the term student athlete is an invented term, invented by the NCAA in the 1950s in a court proceeding where the NCAA argued that they shouldn't have to pay workman's compensation to the widow of a man who died playing football, I believe, for the University of Wyoming. And it has been used over the course of the last 60 years plus now as a way to justify not paying athletes. Well, they're students first, and then they're athletes, even though in the revenue-generating sports and in other sports too, that is a distinction that's really only being used for a financial reason, not some kind of higher-level classification of human being. So with that caveat out of the way, when we talk about athletes at the college level as employees, the argument's been, well, they, this is part of their educational experience. Right. Okay. So the thing is, you're making hundreds of millions of dollars a year off of that labor. And now what makes it even more ridiculous is we've got this house settlement, and the house settlement not only is going to pay a bunch of athletes for NIL opportunities that they missed out on because the NCAA forbade them from accessing them, but you're also going to pay athletes for NIL opportunities to the tune of up to $22 million a year officially through athletic departments. And the NCAA is trying to walk this kind of ridiculous line of claiming that this is not pay for play, this is payment for NIL, for name, image, and likeness. But like the whole idea, and for those of you who, most of you are not IP attorneys, name, image, and likeness is something that you make money off of based upon popularity. Well, where's the popularity stem from? If you're an athlete, it's not just stemming from your good looks or your contributions to society outside of the playing surface. You're making NIL and you're being promised NIL because you're playing sports at an institution. That's why you're getting that money. That's why there's guarantees coming in as far as, if you've got a star center or a star quarterback or a player coming in that's asking for X amount of money. Whatever you want to claim that money's being paid for, in this case, the NCAA trying to claim that it's for NIL and not for playing the sport. Realistically speaking, the university's not paying you that money if you're not playing the sport. If you came in, you got your $1 million in NIL and you were like, I'm good, I'm going to sit out the rest of the season. They're not giving you the money. Like they're in whatever contract is being written up, there's going to be requirements that you're playing the game. So the argument that somehow you're not getting paid to be an athlete, you're just getting paid because of your likeness, that's ludicrous. And I don't think that's going to stand up in court. And, it gets even more complicated when you look at the terms of this settlement, which, as we talked about on the last episode, is based on this idea that athletic departments are going to be given X amount of dollars, up to $22 million to start with, that they themselves can pay athletes for this purpose. And if you look at that, what that looks very much like is a salary cap, right? $22 million, you can't spend more than that, at least not officially through the school. There's other means by which that can happen, which we'll get to in a little bit. Well, that's a restraint on pay. So you've taken a group of people who you for a long time have claimed are not employees, but you're basically paying them as employees because you're not just paying them because they're students. There's going to be clauses in contracts saying they're going to have to play, they're going to have to make appearances. That's an employment contract. But to then try to argue that they're not employees doesn't make a lot of sense. But that's legally what this is hinging on, is this idea that colleges and universities and the NCAA have talked themselves into thinking that they're going to get an antitrust exemption, which will allow them to claim that athletes that play sports for their schools are not employees, but are instead students engaged in extracurricular activities that they're getting paid for. That will lead to lawsuits. That will lead, and actually we see this right now. There's a court case in Colorado. It's Fontenot versus the NCAA, which a lot of people thought was going to be folded into the House settlement, but it has not been. And so what we're now discovering is, even though that may not end up being that big of a court case, people, if they want to, can opt out of the class action settlement in House and opt into, I believe, the class that's going on with this Fontenot case. And this is going to continue because even if this House settlement is signed, even if the Fontenot thing goes nowhere, what you're looking at legally is a scenario where athletes are going to look at this and there's going to, some enterprising lawyers going to say, well, how can the NCAA cap just unilaterally the amount of money that they're paying athletes? If the NCAA tried to do that with coaches, for instance, they'd get sued and they'd lose. This is why, when a lot of people argue that there should be coach compensation, I don't necessarily disagree that coaches are overpaid. Part of the reason that they're overpaid is because that's where a lot of the money has gone that's been earned through college athletics, because you got to spend it somewhere. And if you're not spending it on the athletes, I guess you got to spend it on the coaches. But if you tried to cap coach compensation, like anywhere else in society right now, people would say, well, you're not allowed to do that because that's a business restraint. And there are protections against that in the legal code. It's why, for instance, when people complain about CEO compensation, they say CEO compensation should be capped. It's like, well, that's not really how the system works. Businesses can decide kind of collectively that, somebody's worth, or not collectively, they can decide individually what somebody is or is not worth. But for as much as we talk about the free market in this society, this is the free market at work. It's this idea that, well, if someone's willing to pay me this amount of money, then I'll take that. And you can't say, well, you can't pay over this amount of money, at least not in this circumstance. Now, what will be interesting as we move forward is, will someone from an athlete perspective, not an athletics perspective, a college athlete saying, well, I'm actually not being paid as much as my free market value is worth. And that's because the NCAA has set this cap. What will be the outcome there? I don't know that we'll see anything like that immediately, because a lot of what's going to happen with the big schools ties into something that we're about to answer a question on with from Alex Graham, because he asked the question, what's to stop the Kansases of the world from still paying more money under the table to get ahead? And this is a variation on a couple of other things that are going on simultaneously right now, which is this idea that collectives in the minds of the NCAA are going to be driven out of existence or driven into athletic departments themselves. And the idea is that that's going to solve the collective issue. But the flip side of it is that's not really going to solve the collective issue, because there's no way for the NCAA to regulate how much money a third party is paying athletes. There's nothing in the law that says you can't pay an athlete And now the NCAA themselves is paying athletes at the college level for name, image, and likeness. So they have no leg to stand on. They can't say, well, sorry, outside third party, you're not allowed to do this. They can try, but they'll get sued. This is why, if you've seen all of these cases regarding name, image, and likeness where the NCAA is going after like Florida State or going after somebody else, they really don't have the ability. Miami's another example of this. They really don't have the ability to do anything in court, because the NCAA's whole approach has been based around this idea that they're going to essentially force schools to cower before the NCAA rules book. And if you are foolish enough to agree to the NCAA's sanctioning, as Florida State did, then, okay, you're screwed because you agree to the punishment at that point. If you're not foolish enough to do that, if you're smart and you say, well, no, NCAA, sue us, we'll see you in court, they really can't do anything about what's going on with name, image, and likeness payments. And so this creates a big issue, because ultimately, much as you can't cap coach compensation, you're not going to be able to cap athlete compensation down the line. And schools will either find a way to supersede that number internally, or they'll just maintain their external collectives. They will route money through them, and they will be able to pay players whatever it takes. This is where this economy is going to be fascinating with all of this, because like one of the big stories that got a lot of news the other day, it was a couple weeks ago actually, was that story about the player from Washington. I think we talked about this a little bit on the last podcast, or certainly I talked about it on the Live Assembly Call podcast. There was a basketball player that went to Washington and got $2 million allegedly in NIL. And I think that number's actually legit. I think they got $2 million in NIL payments. And everybody's like, $2 million for a basketball player in Washington who was not even the best player in the portal? What that illustrates, and this is where this gets a little bit complicated and where we really have to think about it from a business perspective more than anything else, is it creates a scenario where if you look at the NFL, if you look at the NBA, if you look at any professional sport, with maybe the exception of baseball, but even baseball, I think there's some elements of this that we have to consider. Salaries are collectively bargained, and they're done in a way that's intended to give athletes what they're looking for up to a certain point, but protect the financial interests of the leagues and the individual teams. That's why you have a salary cap in the NFL, the NBA, and the NHL. And even though there's no salary cap in baseball, if you think about the way that baseball does it, baseball, because it's not intrinsically tied to the college athletics development model, they set it up so that the first 6 years, which are theoretically going to be from a physical perspective the best years that you have as a player, whether you start at 18 or whether you start at 21, the first 6 years, unless you are an exemplary player, if like you're a person who's so far above the mean in terms of how you play your position, your salary is restricted. You're not going to make nearly as much as someone who is past their 6th year of service. And we've seen baseball teams use some chicanery to keep players from getting to that 6th year. Famously, the Cubs did that with Chris Bryant. Got a lot of people upset. I think it was the year before the year that the Cubs won the World Series. It was one of those two. But my point being, professional sports leagues who do this literally for a living, like this is their business, paying players and generating revenue, they put all these protections in to keep costs from spiraling out of control. And, it's why, for like baseball, when baseball lost the ability to dictate contract terms to its players, which was back in the 1970s, Marvin Miller suing Major League Baseball on behalf of free agents who wanted to be free agents, and free agency opens up. It took baseball a long time to get those costs under control, and it made the baseball union and the baseball players kind of the most powerful union within all of sports. Compare that to the NFL, who really like slow played the whole thing, gradually got free agency, but through things like the franchise tag and just through kind of the nature of the game and the lack of guaranteed contracts really kept those costs down. I give you all that boring backstory so that you can understand that what we're seeing in college athletics is truly the worst of both worlds. It is an unregulated system because colleges and universities refuse to acknowledge that they are in the business of professional sports. But now they can't artificially restrict the amount of money that's being made by athletes, which is what they've done up to this point. And so what you've now got is this circumstance where you've got players like this Washington basketball player who's not worth $2 million a year. He's not going to make that big of a difference, but Washington has to overpay because Washington really needs the brand value, especially going into a new conference and, not having that many things that really stick out in terms of, you got their football program clearly, but they would like to have a good basketball program. That's an athletic department that has at least cared about basketball historically. What you've got now is about 70 to 75 major athletic brands. That is your Power Five, plus a couple of schools, maybe minus a couple of schools. All of them are locked in a different sort of business than what professional athletics is locked into. Like ultimately, in all of the pro leagues, NFL, whatever, the team success is important, but it all contributes to the whole. It all contributes to the overall success of the NFL, and that's how things are sold. That's not how things work at the college level. At the college level, at best, it's your conference that you're contributing to, but it's like the real reason why you're in the business of college athletics, if you're an athletic department, if you're a university, is because you're trying to promote your school. You're trying to get people to go to school at your school. You're trying to create an environment that is mediated, is on television, that draws people in, that makes high schoolers and their parents look at your institution and say, wow, that looks fun, or wow, that looks like a fascinating place, or ooh, did you see that commercial at halftime where they've got all those people in lab coats looking at slides? Like that's where I want my kid to go to school. Or if you're a student, that's where I want to go to school because that game looked freaking awesome. That environment looks great. I want to go be a part of that. If you're an athletic department or a university, you want alumni to be proud of the fact that their athletics are doing well. And so you have to pay money to make that happen. And up to this point, there's been an arms race, but it's been through the guise of athletics budgets that don't have to account for paying players. And yet players are the reason why your team is good or bad in most cases. Yes, coaches have something to do with it, but a coach who can't get good players isn't going to be a good coach for very long. So what you're now ending up with is a scenario where all of these schools, who, yes, in many cases belong to conferences, but realistically speaking, they're out for themselves. They're fighting for their own brand value. They're fighting for their own recognition. They're fighting for their own place in the sun. And so as a result, the spending is likely to get way out of control because, as we've seen over and over again, and you see this, frankly, even at the professional level, these organizations cannot help themselves. They will overspend because they will be afraid that if they don't overspend, that they will be relegated to second, third, fourth tier status. You see this in if you ever look at the history of free agency. Like one of the reasons why the NBA has changed its contract approaches so many times and what a max contract is, or what you'd be willing to pay somebody, is because we've seen over and over again franchises overspend to a ridiculous degree on marginal players that don't deserve that money, but that's their market value because if you're not willing to pay it, someone else will. The New York Knicks have gotten joked about, regarding this for a long time, but they're by not nearly the only offender. There's offenders all over the NBA on this, where you'll drop money that there's no reason you should have dropped on players that don't really move the needle, but you're afraid if you don't sign them, you're going to miss out on them and end up with a worse player. And it's why, teams that generally focus on the draft and through building through inexpensive players are, generally more successful because it's more cost effective. But colleges and universities don't know how to do that at the athletic department level. Like they fundamentally, this is uncharted territory. Yes, you've had players getting paid before, but that is now more of an open marketplace. And so what's going to be fascinating is at what point do the clubs and the teams that are used to spending huge amounts of money, this is a lot of your SEC schools in football, certainly schools like Kansas, North Carolina, Kentucky, Indiana in basketball. How much are they willing to spend, which ends up setting the upper tier of the marketplace? And then if you're a team that's in the lower levels of that sport, how much are you willing to spend in order to try to get up to that level? With no regulation on top of it, it's a real problem because, again, as I said, this is not something that colleges and universities know how to manage themselves. And so that's going to be an interesting aspect of the fallout from this House case that I don't think anybody knows the answer to. One of the things we've seen in relation to this is this idea of roster limits and walk-ons no longer being in existence. So there was a story a couple of weeks ago by, I think it was one of the sites that covers Nebraska. And, they had Matt Rule, the head coach at Nebraska, talking about what a catastrophe it would be if we got rid of walk-ons in college football. And this was an interesting thing to me because, one of the arguments that's being made now is essentially, since we're now essentially having to look at athletes as employees, even though the NCAA won't say that, if you're a walk-on, your team is technically paying all of the players for NIL, what makes a walk-on in that case any different from a scholarship athlete? If I'm a walk-on and I make it into the game, or even if I'm just standing on the sideline, like my likeness, which is what I'm theoretically being paid for, is a part of the game. And so now there's been talk about, well, maybe the schools and the athletic departments or the conferences will get together and say, you know what, we're going to go down this pathway of NIL payments and this $22 million cap, but we have to limit our roster sizes to specifically whatever we say they are, 85 for football, 12 or 13 for basketball. That's going to be an interesting thing because one of the things that you see a lot of historical brands in football, certainly I think Nebraska falls into this category, is they will stockpile a lot of players as walk-ons, and in some cases they will develop into scholarship athletes or scholarship caliber athletes. In other cases they may not, but they provide a competitive advantage from a practice perspective. And a lot of people have been willing to do that, but if you're going to predicate the way that you're paying things out on what I just described, and you're also looking across the board at your other sports, in many cases sports that aren't receiving a full complement of scholarships, you've got to think about how we're going to allocate resources. For those who aren't aware, like baseball is a good example of this. Baseball teams at the Division I level in the NCAA, they don't just give scholarships to all of the players. I think it's like they have 11.7 scholarships or whatever the number is. You get a lot of these partial scholarships, or you'll get a full scholarship divided amongst 3 or 4 different athletes. That's been standard practice for a while. And again, it's like, is it ideal? No, but that's how the system has developed over time. What we're watching right now is an alteration of that system, and it could have a lot of interesting effects, including hard limits on those roster sizes, which again is essentially what happens at the professional level. I mean, if you look at the NFL, the NFL has, I think, an active roster limit of 55. You get an inactive group of players every week. There's 7 of those. So you have an active day roster, like a game roster of 48. You get 7 inactive players who are technically on your active roster. And then you get like 14 players, I think, that are on your practice squad. And that's it. But those players get paid. And that's the whole point, is that there's going to be some really interesting knock-on effects in terms of how the very basic concept of a roster is put together at the college level as a result of all of these things. The other thing that I think is going to be fascinating and kind of humorous to watch is this idea of how does the NCAA handle this concept of fair market value. So if you read through a lot of this House material, one of the things that you will note is that the NCAA, through the sources that have been talking about this or have leaked things, really thinks that they're going to have the ability to decide what fair market value is in relation to NIL payments. And their idea still is that if an NIL payment is coming through and it looks like it's pay for play, they're going to say, no, you can't do that because that player is not getting paid their fair market value. How on earth do you determine fair market value? in NIL? Like, what is it? No one knows. And it's particularly humorous from the NCAA itself to be talking about this, given that one of their big arguments against allowing NIL to begin with was that athletes had no fair market value, that they had no value at all, that all of their value was derived from the team that they were playing for. That was clearly not the case, as we've seen players and athletes in general have huge market value that far exceeds what anybody could have predicted. And I'm not just talking about like football players. I'm not simply talking about Bryce Young. Was it Bryce Young that was in the Dr. Pepper commercials? Maybe it wasn't. Well, I'm not just talking about those players. I think it was Bryce Young. I'm also talking about Livy Dunn, who's made huge amounts of money, like sponsoring Vuori. I'm talking about the Cavender twins. I'm talking about, athletes who shouldn't have market value, but there's no way of actually judging what market value is unless it's out there in the mix. And furthermore, if the NCAA is really going to come in and claim that, this NIL deal isn't fair market value, guess what's going to happen? That athlete and that sponsor are going to court. Be like, all right, NCAA, let's see you there. Let's see how well you would judge this. And the NCAA won't be able to win that. It's really going to be fascinating. So, like, you'll hear about fair market value. You'll hear about the NCAA defining and limiting NIL payments, because that's right in the text of what we've seen with this House settlement. I do not, for the life of me, see how they're actually going to be able to pull that off. And that is one of many things about this House settlement where, if you really look at it closely, you're like, I don't know if the NCAA and its member institutions really understood what they were getting themselves into here. But they've created now a system, for at least through my eyes, that's going to be unenforceable and is going to lead to the very thing that the NCAA thinks it's avoiding by agreeing to this House settlement in the first place. So those are some things I wanted to tackle. There was one other thing I wanted to note, and it was this comment from Greg Sankey, the commissioner of the SEC at SEC Media Days, where he made, one of the big canards that's been a part of this debate about athlete compensation at the college level for a while is this idea that, athletes, they don't want to be taxed like employees. And, and Sankey said essentially the same thing again. He said something like, I haven't had any athletes come up and tell me that they want to be taxed as employees. This is one of those things that sounds like it makes a lot of sense until you actually break it down a little bit. So the argument here is that an athlete is getting benefits as a scholarship athlete, as a student, that aren't taxed, and that, you're going to make money off of this NIL deal. Well, that's going to get taxed. You're not going to like that. As I always try to point out to people, if I have a chance to make $10,000 on an NIL deal and it's going to get taxed, 35%. Okay, shucks. I have $6,500 that I didn't have before. What's the downside here? There's, the idea that it's too complicated for athletes to think about taxes. I mean, at the end of the day, these are all adults. These are all 18-year-olds. Many of them have had jobs before. And the bigger crime here, frankly, in my opinion, is the NCAA refusing to provide any assistance to its athletes to help them figure out their financial circumstances, when the NCAA is also requiring them in many cases to work 60 to 80 hours a week at being athletes. It's hard to take, the arguments about, we need to teach financial literacy and then turn around and do something like that if you're the NCAA and its member institutions. But the idea that athletes don't want to get into employment contracts because they might get taxed. It's kind of like, you don't want a job of any sort because you're going to get taxed. It's like, yes, it's part of being in society. Nobody likes taxes, but if you make money, would you rather have the money minus the taxes or no money at all because you weren't earning the money? That's essentially the dichotomy that exists with this argument. And so whenever you hear that brought forward, like athletes don't really want to be taxed, athletes would like to make money. And if you make money in this society or any other society, basically, you're going to get taxed on it. So I really don't think that that's a reasonable argument. But it's something that keeps coming up and is still being trotted out by a lot of these college sports leaders. And it's like, I just, like, whoever told you that that was a winning argument, it doesn't matter to the people for whom it's the most important, which is the people that actually stand to have a chance to make the money. So last thing I wanted to hit on this episode Actually, two things real quick. We had a question from Dr. Jan Bomer from University of Michigan. Thanks for responding to the poll. How do you think this impacts international players that can't fully take advantage of NIL? So this is an interesting thing. One of the things about the international scene, there are ways for international athletes to make money via NIL. Now, can they make the same amount of money as domestic athletes? In some cases, yes. In some cases, no. It could be easier for international athletes to access this. And there are actually some bills that are being floated that would amend the Immigration and Nationality Act to allow international athletes to earn money through NIL. Again, though, when I'm asked about this, I'm not unsympathetic to the plight of international athletes who are playing in the U.S. But the problem that I think most people don't understand is, like, this is not an NCAA restriction. This is not even something that's a restriction that comes from colleges and universities. This is a restriction that comes from the way the U.S. handles immigration. And it's not just the U.S. This is something that is handled this way all over the world. Essentially, the Cliff Notes version of how this works is that when you are in another country from wherever your passport is, you are essentially you're there on a visa. Not the credit card, but essentially it's a document that says why you're in the country. And a student visa is a student visa kind of everywhere. You're allowed to go and study, but you're not allowed to earn money through a job because there's a different type of visa for that purpose. There are a bunch of different types of visas that apply in these circumstances. I mean, there are specific visas just for internationally recognized athletes and entertainers who come to the U.S. to perform at events or competitions, and there's reciprocal agreements there. So, what you're dealing with is a situation where, because the NCAA continues to classify athletes as students, that means that an international athlete who's here playing sports is classified as an international student who just happens to be playing an extracurricular. That's why, and you can still get around it. There are ways around the visa situation. You need some good lawyers. So we've got international athletes who are making money via NIL. Maybe not as much as the most popular American athletes, but in many cases, that's because the American athletes have a higher brand value than the international athletes do. Not in every case, but that's one of the reasons why. Now, if the NCAA changes the classification of athletes so that they are employees, that might solve some things for international athletes, but it might also create some issues, because if you are then coming over as an employee, well, now that changes your visa status, which right now has you here as a student. This is a larger topic that is hard to fully parse out because I'm not as versed in this part of the law. But, it's not just as simple as has been portrayed in some corners of the media, like, well, international athletes just being deprived. It's like, it's not really how it works. And again, this is something that would happen just as much if a similar situation was taking place in France or in England, where an American there is going to have a very similar set of restrictions as far as what they're allowed to do outside of the traditional educational environment. So just something to keep in mind with all of this. Last thing I wanted to tackle is actually more of a realignment question. And this came in from one of our listeners, Neil, regarding Cal and Stanford. And Neil's question was, what about Stanford and UC Berkeley to the Big Ten? I'd like to think those schools fit the Big Ten far better than the ACC. And if the Big Ten had a Western division of 2 to 4 additional schools, parentheses 6 to 8 in all, those teams could mostly play each other and travel could be reduced a lot. Do we see a prospect of that happening? And what I said in response was, I don't see that happening. And here's why. Right now, it has very little to do with the convenience of travel. It has very little to do with the academic reputation. I mean, clearly, if there's 2 schools on the West Coast that the Big Ten, from an academic perspective, would love to add, it'd be Stanford and Cal. 2 of the finest institutions, one private, one public, in the country. There's a lot to like about both those institutions academically. And as Neil said, from a travel perspective, got to be a lot easier if all of the West Coast teams in the Big Ten had 5 teams they could play locally, as opposed to 3, which is what they've currently got. But it's not about that. It's not about academics. It's not about travel. The closest I can provide as an analogy, for those of you who follow auto racing, there's been this big hullabaloo around F1 as Michael Andretti and the Andretti Racing Group has tried to partner with Cadillac to gain entry into Formula One. Right now, there's 10 teams of 2 cars per team in Formula One, so 20 spots on the grid total. That's it. There's only 20 cars in every race. Andretti wanted a new entry into F1 so that it would be 22 cars instead of 20, which isn't a big deal in the competitive scheme of things, I don't think. I mean, the Indy 500 has 33, and the average IndyCar race will normally have like 24 to 26. So it's like, it's a doable number. It's not like it ruins the kind. It's not like, it'd be like, it's not like adding an extra football player where now you've got 12 on the field or anything like that. It doesn't upset the balance. But F1's been like, no, absolutely not. The only way that Andretti's going to get in is if they buy an existing team. And the reason they're doing that is because the F1 teams that exist do not want to lose money from the television contracts and other revenue agreements that they've got coming in. So right now, essentially, they've got a big pie in Formula One, and they are dividing it, 10 ways. Well, you get less money if you divide it 11 ways, which doesn't seem like, that's like that 1/10 versus 1/11 doesn't feel like a whole lot. It's like 1.5%, but 1.5% of like $1 billion is a lot of money. And the argument there is, well, why would we take money off of the plate and give it to somebody else when we don't have to? And that's essentially the situation that you're dealing with Stanford and Cal with the Big Ten, and why they went to the ACC, why they weren't invited to the Big Ten in the first place, is that Stanford and Cal, while great academic institutions, don't bring anything to the table in terms of audience. Cal's got a very small fan base in football. It's loyal, but it's very small. Stanford's is even smaller. Stanford does not have a big alumni base. Cal's alumni base is not that vociferously in support of Cal athletics. And so you're actually, it's not adding anything to the table in terms of the amount of money that Fox might be willing to pay for advertising. Stanford and Cal aren't drawing enough new viewers and new interest that it would generate additional money. By comparison, Washington and Oregon got added to the Big Ten because Fox was like, look, we really should add these 2 schools because they will bring additional money in, because they are both national. Oregon's certainly a national brand, and Washington is a very important brand in Seattle, which is a huge market. Stanford and Cal don't really bring that. Like, neither of them bring the Bay Area. And you've already got California pretty much sewed up because you got USC and UCLA. So what's the point? And this is essentially how I would look at it at this stage. It's like, we're not going to divide the pie any more than we absolutely have to. And that's why, I think any expansion that might occur moving forward, tying back to something we talked about on the last podcast, a lot of it's going to depend exactly on that. Is it a situation where that team or those teams really bring something to the table that we don't already have? And there's very few teams left that are like that for any of these conferences. It's why everybody's watching the ACC so closely, because there you've got 4 brands tied very closely to the ACC, 3 of them in the ACC, that do move the needle in terms of national audience. And that's, of course, Florida State, Clemson, North Carolina, and Notre Dame, who is trying to prop the ACC up as much as possible in order to keep from having to subjugate themselves in a conference. But if the ACC breaks open, if Florida State or Clemson are able to, or both, are successfully able to sue the ACC, get out of the grant of rights agreement, well, first of all, there's a bidding war suddenly as the Big Ten and the SEC compete over who grabs either of those teams. Then you have North Carolina, who will certainly be looking to save themselves at that point. And then you've got Notre Dame, who, if you don't have Florida State, Clemson, and North Carolina in the ACC suddenly is arguably worse than the Big 12 in terms of what to belong to. But that's about it. Like, there's not a lot of other needle-moving brands out there. And unfortunately for Stanford and Cal, they're just not quite in that echelon. You could say the same thing about some teams in the Big Ten. I think, Rutgers falls into this category. Purdue falls into this category. We're not necessarily talking about success. We're talking about brand power. We're talking about eyeballs and televisions. And, just how many people are really tuning in to watch Purdue athletics or Rutgers athletics nationwide. And, Indiana, I know people like to joke about Indiana getting kicked out. It's like Indiana brings a huge audience that doesn't make a lot of sense given the proportionality of success that they've had. Not everybody brings that to the table. Indiana's very lucky that they've got such, strong brand association amongst their alumni, because that's really kept them afloat and part of these conversations. But that's why you won't see Stanford and Cal in the Big Ten. It's just that the ship has sailed to some degree. And I think if that was going to happen, we would have seen it happen last year. And you wouldn't have had this entire ACC reorganization, which probably isn't going to last very long as it is. Anyway, that's going to wrap it up for this episode. On the next episode, we'll be hopefully joined by a guest. We're going to talk through some new model ideas for the NCAA. We'll also talk more specifically about this House case, some things that I've missed that perhaps we need to talk about more fully. All of that coming up on the next episode of CrimsonCast that we do on college athletics. We might do another one in between now and then. But stay tuned here. Be sure to check out the Substack and get the latest podcasts directly from us. Also go to the Back Home Network and subscribe to our YouTube channel where you can watch these podcasts, not just listen to them. For the whole network, I'm Galen Clavio. Thank you for joining us, folks. We'll catch you on the flip side. Bring back the Bison. So long, everybody.